some, a COVID infection lasts a few weeks. For others, it's fatal. For me, I battled long COVID for 2 years, where I confronted heart issues, brain fog, body aches, fatigue, and difficulty walking, despite having no pre-existing conditions and only being 23. This battle with acquired disability in my early 20s inspired me to build my first startup, Strong Haulers, where we used wearables and technology to help patients like myself manage our symptoms and identify our symptom triggers. After an incredible ride building my first startup, we've since winded down, but I'm reminded of the fact that there are still over 400 million people globally who haven't recovered from the COVID virus, despite the prevalence and availability of vaccines and antivirals, causing over $1 to $4 trillion lost in global GDP due to high medical expenses and lost productivity. Now it's 2024, and many people are probably wondering, why am I talking about viruses and COVID-19? And to that, I'll say that viruses, as old as human history, have always had long-term effects. And COVID-19 is just the most recent. We see Epstein-Barr gave us MS, HPV gives us cervical cancer, Lyme gave us chronic Lyme, and HIV gives us AIDS, and so on. And so to reiterate the point, viruses have always had long-term effects. And this is only going to get worse because as global temperatures rise and due to man-made climate change and the permafrost melts in the Arctic, bacteria that hasn't encountered our civilization will come out and interact with humanity, making the probability of pandemics and mass disabling events like long COVID all the more likely. So to prepare for the pandemics of tomorrow, my call to all the investors in the room today is to invest in long COVID. And we can do that by looking at the three legs of this emerging long COVID economy, made up of startups that are helping patients manage their symptoms, expand access to care, and finally, building the infrastructure for drug development. To contextualize where these solutions fit, let's look back to the patient journey and understand, what is it like to have long COVID? For those wondering, this is actually a comic of me, quite handsome, I know, that I worked on with the American Heart Association. When I first got long COVID 3 years ago, I didn't know I had long COVID. All I noticed was that it was difficult to breathe. I couldn't walk. I had this insane pain in my chest, and it was difficult for me to recall words and form sentences out loud. And so I then spent the next 6 months shuffling from doctor's appointment to doctor's appointment, trying to find someone who can explain to me what was going on with my body. It was like puberty, but way worse. I finally found a doctor who not only believed that my symptoms were real, but who was able to give me a diagnosis and saying, hey, you have long COVID. At the time, I thought that this would be the end of my journey, but it was only the beginning. You see, at the time, and even today, long COVID has no FDA-approved treatments, and there are over 200 distinct symptoms with the condition, meaning every patient has a different journey. And so kickstart another 6 to 12 months where I'm jumping from doctor's appointment to doctor's appointment, accumulating tens of thousands of medical debt, trying to figure out how can I live with these symptoms of not being able to walk, difficulty breathing, and so on. I scoured support groups. I looked all over the world for specialists and so on. And finally, after 2 years from my first infection, I was able to walk again and manage my symptoms and finish my master's degree, one of the best days of my life after I left school. And so looking at this experience of what patients go to, we can map on the three stools of the long COVID economy. We see that in the beginning of the journey, access to care matters a lot, but towards the middle and end, after diagnosis and so on, giving treatments and helping patients manage their symptoms becomes really important. So which is why, let's look at the patient journey and let's start talking about startups in the space. I'm really excited at the beginning, at the onset of symptoms area. There's startups like Euphonia and Artemed that are using AI and technology to help identify patients early on in the journey. Euphonia uses AI to slow down to improve clinical workflows and tries to help long COVID clinics that have 6-month-long wait lists triage and identify the really high impact, high risk patients. Artemed, on the other hand, mines electronic health records to create symptom profiles to detect patients who could be at risk of long COVID and ensure that those patients are given access to care. Fast forward to the diagnosis side, there's companies like TestKey and Molecular Biosciences, who I'm really excited about, who are building some of the first diagnostics for long COVID. Right now, as I said earlier, there are no diagnostics for long COVID. The condition is a diagnosis of exclusion. But if we can find a diagnostic test that can say that someone has X% probability of long COVID, that'll cut down the 6 months that I had to spend shuffling around searching for that elusive diagnosis. There's other companies, once we have diagnoses like IMU, where after that we know that they have long COVID, we can connect them by giving them collecting at-home blood samples from them that creates longitudinal data that can be used for research and clinical trials. The final area that I'll talk about are companies working in the care management side. I'm really excited about startups that are trying to expand the functionality of wearable devices that were built for athletes rather than sick people. Really excited about Visible. Visible is a direct to consumer startup led by a patient himself who's raised over $1 million with around 150,000 active users, where they have built a software that integrates with a Polar chest strap and gives patients a daily readiness score, a pacing score to tell you what is the probability that you're going to have a symptom flare. The next startup is Lumia, founded by the same guy who created the Bose Sleep Bud. It's the only hard tech medical device I've found where Daniel Lee, the Bose founder, is creating an in-ear wearable to help patients detect blood flow in their head and to identify their likelihood of developing fatigue and brain fog. They've raised at a 20 million valuation. And then finally, I'll share Pathai's Health. Alex came out of Northwestern, so local to here in Illinois. He's also working, and he's a dear friend of mine who's also working on expanding the functionality of wearables for people with complex illnesses. The next area of startups that I'm really excited about within the long COVID space are those that are providing accountability and peer support to long COVID long haulers. Long COVID is a very isolating experience. Not many people know what it's like to go on. Community is really important. And so both MyMe and GoodPath themselves are expanding offerings for wellness coaches, clinical pathways, education, peer support, and so on. I personally am really excited about GoodPath. They've raised at a 60 million valuation. They're profitable. They're also been entering the employee benefits and disability carrier space. And most importantly, they're tackling cancer care, diabetes, musculoskeletal pain, behavioral health on top of long COVID. So as you see, you have companies that are directly focused on long COVID, and then you have companies that are using long COVID as an add-on to their services. And finally, the last startup that I want to profile is Rhythm, backed by Y Combinator and Khosla Ventures, led by a rockstar team of scientists and physicians, where they've created the first integrative health clinic that's fully virtual, serving people with infection-associated chronic conditions like long COVID, ME/CFS, and so on. They've raised $6 million. Collectively, all of these startups who make up the long COVID economy have raised $80 million at $180 million valuation. And while this is an emerging space with some really exciting initial activity, there's still so much more space and opportunity for innovation. I've highlighted some of the problem statements I'd love to see investors and entrepreneurs tackle in this space. And so just to close out my presentation, I want to leave you all, if you're excited about the long COVID economy the way I am, I want to leave you with 3 calls to action. The first is I'd love for you guys to download my investment thesis. I've spent the last 5 months, or maybe even the last 4 years, thinking about how to grow an innovation economy for long COVID. I've profiled in my thesis, I highlight what is long COVID, what are some of the startups active in the space, what are some of the challenges investors should look at when assessing the maturity of this market, as well as considerations for problem statements going forward. So please look at my thesis. I'd love to get your feedback on it, as it's really been a labor of love the last 4 years. The second is please consider connecting with many of the founders who I've highlighted. I've put together through the work of this thesis a group chat of every single long COVID backed VC founder. We're all together. They're all wishing me luck on my phone right now, where we share insights, information, commiserate about building in this space. So many of them will be getting ready to raise in the next 6 to 12 months. I would love to connect you with them, as well as give you my opinion as a former LP and founder on what I think about the deal. So please, let's talk afterwards. And finally, some people know this, but I was on the Harris campaign and it didn't go the way I was hoping. And so I'm currently unemployed. And so I would love for someone to hire me, because in another world, I would be a political appointee going to the White House. us and doing some cool stuff in climate and healthcare. But that has not happened. So thank you so much, everyone. Really glad to be here.